Hello, I'm Brian Canfield, and today we're going to unravel the mystery of stained glass. In this episode, we're going to talk about some of the art history of stained glass, in particular the medieval times, which is also known as the Middle Ages. Later in the further episodes, we're going to discuss some of the materials and the processes and the techniques in stained glass. Starting out, though, I would like to talk about what we know as the beginning of the stained glass history. And typically, people like to refer to the Middle Ages or the medieval time in particular about this period of stained glass. It started, around the fall of the Roman Empire, or the 5th century. It ended when, I like to say, the Renaissance. In the beginning of the medieval time of stained glass, we start with Romanesque. And stained glass, really coincides with architecture throughout the ages, and in particular this Romanesque style of architecture, which was common in Europe. Between around the 9th and 12th centuries, it combined elements of architectural types, both Roman and from the Byzantine empires. This style is typified by semi-round arches, versus as we get later into the medieval time, we get into more of those pointed arches. Since time immemorial, light has stood for an irresistible analogy of clarity, vitality, divinity, and all that's good. Painters, in the fine arts, who deal with oils and watercolor, they must work to achieve an effect of richness, creating this illusion of light. Whereas in stained glass, it begins with the richness, and they work as hard to achieve an eloquent sobriety utilizing the light itself. It's quite a different approach. We still go about it at the same idea of starting with light and, bringing it down. This, is what I like to call the mystery of stained glass. Here we have the oldest excavated tangible evidence of painted stained glass. People consider this ahead of Christ. This was discovered in 1934 in Germany, and they date it to around the 9th or 10th century. Now, if we look at this particular piece, the remnants were pieced together. It is leaded, but it's also painted. And when I say painted, we're using vitreous pigment that's fired, and when fired, it becomes permanent. It literally fuses into the glass. And how do I know this is painted? Well, if we look at the face, these lines within this one piece of glass, this is what we call trace painting. And again, we still use this technique today. This head of Christ is what is considered the oldest image of Christ in stained glass. This is dated around 1060 to 1090. This actually was discovered in France, and we would also coin this towards the early Romanesque time of the medieval ages. Here we have the classic use of blue glass in the black background. In addition, we have the red. Also, this face, we also see this vitreous pigment used that is fired, and that's why these faces and images still exist today, because once the pigment is fired, it's literally forever. The only thing that can really get rid of the pigment is if the piece is broke. Here we have a German image. This is actually the oldest surviving stained glass in situ. This particular piece is in a series of 5, the figures of the Old Testament, and it's seemingly big. It's roughly around 8 feet tall, which is somewhat monumental. But in comparison to the Gothic architecture, the Romanesque architecture, as we said, is smaller, has that rounded arch at the top. And, being limited by the architecture, we only have an 8-foot window. But here in Germany, they don't have this use of a lot of the blues and the reds in the background. They have somewhat of a limited color, both in France, England, and Germany. And in Germany and France, we see, as I said before, they used a lot of red and blue in the background, but here we see in this one they use a lot of greens and browns, ambers, and if they do use blue, it's more of like a gray color. Now these windows are quite fragile, and both nature and humankind can be very detrimental to the stained glass. And I like to say, you know, stained glass is somewhat like a flower. You know, sometimes it can withstand a hurricane, other times it takes just the snap of fingers to break a flower. And it's quite phenomenal that this particular piece still exists and that it actually has lasted this long in situ. Once we get from the Romanesque into the Gothic, there's a considerable difference in the particular style of architecture. And in this particular Gothic style, we see a larger, massive buildings. You know, of course, we all know about the flying buttress and how it allowed the soaring ceilings and much larger facades. And stained glass that is, you know, intricately a part of this architecture really started to get much more monumental in size. This particular slide is somewhat the mid-Gothic time period in Le Mans, and it's actually divided into segments. Here, this is actually one of the oldest known segmented stained glass. So in this detail shot, we see the early example of regularly alternating compartments, which is this narrative. And see, when I say regularly alternating, we have the circular and square compartments. Now this was, you know, a technique in design that allowed a little more access to the individual narratives. Also here we have the classic ruby, green, and amber. The ruby and the green and the blues, you know, the color derived from the glass, they were somewhat limited to the kind of colors because of their limitations of understanding how to color glass. This amber that we see here, this is actually an applied silver oxide stain. In addition, another technique they would use for this ruby red color is what we now refer to as flashed glass. In making red glass in some of these deeper colors, they realized that if they had an 1/8 inch of glass of this particular color, it got so dark it wasn't allowed to, wouldn't allow illumination. So what they would do is they would use a lot of clear glass with a small film of red. Here we have a mid to late 12th century French Gothic. This particular panel again shows a lot of the use of the reds and the blues. This is St. Denis, and Abbot Suger of St. Denis, you know, he was somewhat, they attribute him to really starting the ideology that moved into the Gothic architecture. He actually recognized the luminous quality of stained glass and how it seemed to deny the impenetrable nature of matter. You know, if you have light hitting most matter, you're not going to get this translucency. But he realized, you know, when he was looking at the stained glass in his particular church, you know, he saw the openings not as a function of the architecture, but saw it as a translucent surface, you know, to be adorned with these sacred paintings. And really, this is the true transition, you know, from this Romanesque to kind of Gothic style architecture and stained glass. And here again, you know, we see this very largely used reds and blues in the background. And also, you know, the designers and the craftsmen and the artists during this day, they paid really close attention to the saturation and optical interpretation of light through the colored glass. I mean, they really understood how they relate to one another as far as, you know, the shapes, in addition to the illumination of the glass. So they really had a masterful understanding of how to create vibrations and really a variegated movements of illumination within these pieces. This particular slide is also French Gothic, and we'd say it's about the mid Gothic time. This is also St. Denis. It's the first case in which the hierarchy of Gothic style is achieved, where space, light, and line and geometry created this transcendent, you know, architectural vision. This new architectural order, you know, that this Abbot Suger kind of created, it assumes, you know, the architectural magnitude of these buildings. They assume the authority over all the narrative images. So really, the stained glass, the subjects dissolved eventually into the harmonious parts of the architecture, and the building itself really was an example of the cosmic order. So, you know, decoratively, you know, in the Romanesque, you would have the subjects and the stained glass become, you know, the focal point, whereas when we got into the Gothic, it's the actual structure itself became the focal point. Here we have somewhat of a late 12th century French window. If we look at some of the differences, you know, as time moved on and you had certain provincial differences, we don't have as much use of red and blue in the background. You know, this window appears flat with banded robes and an austere frontal pose that really harkens back to some of this Romanesque type design, but yet you see a higher level of craft and artistry, which is evident in the design and the variegation of illumination within the robe itself. But here again, we have this kind of flat facial expression. It's not, you know, it's not quite to the highest level, but certainly the use of color and line has developed a little further in artistry at this point. Now as we move on into the high Gothic time, which would be towards the end, we're talking the 13th and 14th century. Here we have Notre Dame in Paris. The stained glass artists create an area of color at this point. You know, this is a huge window, you know, with the techniques in architecture and materials that they started to develop. Now we have entire walls of glass. And, you know, the artist creates an area of colored light, you know, that is still modified by this use of vitreous pigment, monochromatic application of the paint. It's as if, you know, these artists, you know, they were composing music of light. It's instantaneous in space and energized by the physical property of the light waves. Since the architecture and the stained glass started to grow in size, you know, the stained glass would often dominate an entire facade, and the viewer is immersed in a luminous energy that seems almost inanimate. This particular window, I mean, it's almost 40 feet in diameter. It's just massive. Here, this is Chartres, again French. This is around the 13th century. You know, when light passes through glass, it radiates out and may interact with other colors in close proximity. Thus, red and blue, seen side by side, may be seen as somewhat of a purple haze the further you get back from it. And because, you know, when light transitions through glass, it radiates out And if you have two pieces in close proximity, and of course red and blue, when they combine, you get this kind of a purple haze. So in this particular window, once they became more aware of this particular phenomena, they would actually segment the reds and the blues and different colors by what we see here. It's what they call white glass, but what we commonly refer to as clear nowadays. And that really allowed a more definitive viewing of those particular colors, and they didn't quite blend as much. And so we see this used quite a bit in the backgrounds of a lot of the glass during this time. In this particular window, as far as subject matters, not only do we have biblical scenes, but we have astrological scenes, which are also depicted as a narrative in these particular medallions. This particular image comes from the 13th century. It's the Last Judgment of Hell. This is in, again, the French Gothic. Here we see the use of vitreous pigment in the trace lines, but now, they started to develop this idea of controlling the light at a much greater intensity, and so they would actually start putting a matte finish, which is kind of a wash on the glass. So the glass itself, since it was hand blown, you had this variation of size, thickness, which lends to darker and lighter colors. But then also they would add this pigment, which a lot of people think this is dirt, but it's not. This is actually intentional, and it's really to create more of a vibrant variegation of light. As time went on and buildings got larger, we find, the need for more light. When using these darker jewel tones and colors, it really subdued a lot of the illumination within the architectural space. So the radiance of the windows determined by the effects of the environment, such as the direct or indirect sunlight, clouds, trees, arches, and other these architectural features, in addition to these darker colors of glass. So in some circumstances, again, we find this desire for more illumination. So some of the colors and designs would shift into less traditional colors, and we see a more increased use of clear glass. And again, we still see this use of vitreous pigment, and on clear glass then we're putting not only trace lines of geometric details and intricate patterns, but we still see this use of a wash which kind of mutes and grays the glass. We call that grisaille. Here's a little more complicated, more intricate use of grisaille. But here we see a more of a use of silver stain. Now this is a silver oxide, and when I say silver, that's somewhat misleading. It's making that amber color that's applied on the backside of glass. This really became quite prominent around the 13th and 14th century, the use of silver stain. Here we have another rose window around, again, the 13th and 14th century, the High Gothic time. This is Strasbourg and Notre Dame. This High Gothic rose window, now we see more clear glass, again, because possibly of that need of illumination, and also these yellow bands on the interior, more use of that silver stain. It became quite more prominent than the use of the reds and the blues as we saw before. This is a detail of a German window in the 14th century. The use of silver stains really became very popular, and in this particular scene we have silver stain practically on every individual piece here, in addition to this vitreous pigment. So their understanding of firing and pigment permanency was getting quite intricate. And in addition, we start to see a shift from these biblical type classic traditional subject matter, and all of a sudden we get into this more, vernacular kind of everyday man, and here we see a scene of a miner. So not only did the techniques and color start to change, but they started to adopt this different narrative of subject matter. Here, this is a lower portion of the window that we just saw. Again, a heavy use of these silver stains. We still see this kind of flat, linear, use within the faces and the hands. However, if we look at this background, I mean, their understanding of painting became a little more complicated, and you see this heavy use of detail. Now, at this point, by this time in the late Gothic, they started to, become less harsh of painters, and they started to really become aware of softening the edges and softening these features. Here we have more smooth natural forms. It's an elegant, somewhat delicate realism. In addition, I said that we're transitioning from this biblical into more of the everyday vernacular subject matter, but that everyday subject matter would also reflect, some of the pageantry of the royal courtly life. Also, some of the cosmopolitan nature of everyday life. And here again, we see this heavy use of silver stain. And finally, at this slide, we are transitioning into the beginning of the Renaissance. This we really see more of a complicated understanding of perspective and even shadowing. So we're now getting into more of a three-dimensional realism, not only with the figures, but here we have this linear perspective, which really is illustrated by this checkered, diminishing viewpoint as it goes back on the floor. And here we still have this, heavy use of the silver stain, trace lines in the vitreous pigment, and in addition, the matting. Now, that is just a quick summation of medieval stained glass. From the Renaissance on, it gets far more complicated. The level of understanding of artistry and perspective and chiaroscuro is much more deeper. But I decided to keep it at the medieval stained glass because it's a good stopping point. As we transition into the further episodes, we're going to go over more materials and the processes of stained glass. So I hope you enjoyed this art history of the medieval stained glass. I'll see you next time.